Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Brooklyn Book Festival 2021 edition. My name is Rob Fields, and I am thrilled to be here with this great panel where the topic tonight is driven by the living past with our panelists, Tiya Miles, Farah Jasmine Griffin, and Clint Smith III. We're going to be talking about their books, the grappling with history and what it can do for us all. Um, as we start this, I think that I was asked to be a part of this panel because for the last 3.5 years, I was the steward of a Black historical site here in New York City. I was the executive director of the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York. Was the site of one of the largest free Black communities in pre-Civil War America. And much of what we grappled with at Weeksville during my tenure there and through the history of this, this cultural institution was how to make the past relevant and resonant for contemporary audiences. So it's not some thing that, oh, that happened a long time ago, but it's actually could be an inspiration to help shape the future. And so I've come to this conversation from that vantage point. But let me tell you a little bit about our three panelists. We've got a great panel here today. In alphabetical order, Farah Jasmine Griffin was the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University, where she is also the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She is author of numerous books, including Read Until You Understand, and the recipient of a 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship. Tiya Miles is a professor of history and the Radcliffe Alumni Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard. She's a recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship and the Hiett Prize in Humanities from the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. We welcome Tiya, I'm sorry. And our last but not least is Clint Smith III. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of the narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, which was a #1 New York Times bestseller and has been long listed for the 2021 National Book Awards in nonfiction. Welcome to you all. So to get started with this panel, I think, and I think Farah would certainly agree with me, let's start with Morrison. Yeah. Morrison, Toni Morrison wrote in her essay, The Site of Memory, she said that it's a kind of literary archaeology talking about the work that she does. On the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork, you journey to a site to see what remains were left behind and to reconstruct the world that these remains imply. So my first question to all three of you is, what did you find in the remains of each of the places, areas, books that you worked with, and what directions did that send you off in? Farah, Tiya, Clint, this is no time for shyness.
Well, I sort of feel intimidated answering that question in the presence of sort of the historians on the panel. The two amazing historians, authors of these wonderful books, both of them long listed for the National Book Award. Congratulations to you both.
Yes,
I think that what I found, my book is, in some ways, it's memoir. So the past is the past of the city that I was from and the family that I'm from, but also all of these amazing texts. And one of the things that I sort of knew, but it just was confirmed, was that space, that site of Philadelphia had long been the home to a Black community that was engaged in really courageous resistance, and really sort of willing to stand up against the powers that be and speak truth to power and act when necessary. And it just felt, like a kind of context that I thought was very important for the time that I was writing in and the time that the book would appear in. It was just to have that memory of that kind of historic legacy.
Well, I have to begin by saying it's such a pleasure and privilege to be here with all of you. And Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin is a legend in her own time and in our time. I'm so honored to be here, Farah, with you talking about history, and so nice to meet you, Rob. So wonderful to meet you. I love this first question, Rob, about what we found in the past and what remains we uncovered. My book, which is called All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake, is about an artifact. It is about a remain, which is this cotton sack that a number of African-American women passed down through their family line, their female family line, across multiple generations and across space, across time. And so in my work for this particular book, what I found in the past was actually an object. It was actually a thing, which when considered very carefully, opened up into many, many stories about the thing itself, about these women, about their places, about their times, and about African-American resistance, to pick up on something that Farah has said. I will also add that I found emotion in the remains of this past. Emotion experienced, felt, articulated, sometimes hidden away by multiple people. Emotion that was sometimes surprising and challenging to know how to interpret and how to interact with and how to respond to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo that it is an immense honor to be here with all of you and writers and thinkers who, Tiya and Farah, whose work is so and has been so important for our intellectual and cultural and literary tradition over the past many years. So I'm grateful to be here and spend the time with you all. I only wish it could be on the same stage in person, but hopefully we're moving toward that time and place. So my book is it began thinking about this question, and it began when I saw the several Confederate statues come down in my hometown of New Orleans. So statues to PG2 Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and I was watching these statues come down in May 2017 and thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway, that my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy, that my parents still live on a street named after somebody who owned over 150 enslaved people. And what we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols, they are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry, and those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it is to say that it helps us understand the way that all these things are part of an ecosystem of ideas and memory that help us ground what has happened in the past, both on a national level and on a local level, and then better situates us to make amends for much of the harm that has been done across generations in order to build the sort of society we purport to want to live in. And so I've been part of what the book is interested in is exploring how different places across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their own relationship to the history of slavery. To what extent are they being honest? To what extent are they being dishonest? And to what extent are they doing something in between? So I'm really fascinated by the project of public memory and the way that our institutions and physical landscapes shape how we make sense of or fail to make sense of all that has come before us.
That's great. Um, as you all were writing this book, your books, how did your, as you're learning more about a physical object, or Farah going through the books that your father bequeathed you, or in Clint, you are visiting these sites, uh, how did your love for your ancestors deepen? How did it change as you learn more and more about the subjects you were writing about? Because there is that thread of love throughout everything, particularly, certainly with you, Farah, but certainly there is this sense of love throughout the story of Ashley and that sack. There is certainly the love, certainly Clint, when you bring your book back to your grandparents, who are like, we lived this sort of thing. So how did the writing, the research, the experience of creating these books impact the way you saw your families, the people you cared most about, the larger community, things like that?
I think that I sort of approached it knowing that these were people who I loved, but there was a level of appreciation and a sort of understanding of the courage. And I think that even as because I also write about people who are flawed individuals, but that just, lent depth to their humanity. And I thought, one of the stories that I one of the ways of explaining it is I describe a love story in my family that was like a Romeo and Juliet love story, teenagers, but I say Romeo and Juliet were just up against two feuding families, and this couple was up against, oh my God, the history of racism and poverty in this nation in the mid 20th century. And that they were able to sustain a love for each other and their children. I think it sort of just increased my admiration and love for them.
Tiya, Clint?
Well, the sack that is the center of my book has an embroidered story on it. So sentences that talk about the history of these women and their experiences of the child, Ashley, who was 9 years old, being sold away from her mother, Rose. And the sack was packed with multiple items for Ashley by Rose upon their separation. One of the things inscribed on that sack that oral history in the family passed down as among the things that Rose packed was love. So there's a list of things on the sack, very material things, a dress, nuts, and then love and emotion at the center of the inscription, at the center of the story. And so I was really overwhelmed by the meaning of that. And I have to admit that it took me kind of too long to allow myself to focus in on that and to even allow that emotion of love to drive the way I told the history. Because my first instinct was, well, I suppose it wasn't instinctual, it was really training, academic training, right? Was to try to take a step back and to try to analyze everything that was going on in a certain kind of way with a certain kind of distance. And I had to come back around and say, no, really, these women are telling one another, and they are telling us, the people who are so fortunate to be able to look upon this object and to think about it, that love was among the gifts that an enslaved mother gave to her daughter, and that love is among the things that was passed down. So once I accepted that this was true about this artifact, true about their lives, and it had to dominate my history, I then became so much more open to the importance of emotion in the past, and the people's lives in the past, and also in the ways in which we interact with the past and make meaning of the past in our own time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and on my end, I would say that part of what the physical act of going to these places did, and standing on this land and standing in these buildings, is that it gave me not only a sense of our sort of collective physical proximity to this history, but also our temporal proximity to it, right? Like it gave me a much stronger sense of my relative proximity to these people who I've been told my entire life in ways explicit and implicit were people who lived, you know, in like a different, completely different era. Like, you know, I remember being taught about slavery as a child and being made to, you know, I felt like it was like in the Jurassic period. Like it was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery, as if they all existed together at the same time. And, you know, I think about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016.
Right.
And she was the daughter of an enslaved person, right? Like not the granddaughter, not the great granddaughter. She was the daughter in 2016 of someone born into chattel slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old son sits on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded again that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago, just truly wasn't that long ago at all. And so the idea that that would have nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like is revealed to be even more morally and intellectually disingenuous. And I think too, you know, it made me feel so indebted to and so grateful for and so in awe of the generations of folks who came before me and made my life possible in ways that just felt more acute, you know, like standing in a cabin where enslaved people had lived. And I thought about, you know, slavery, if we think about, you know, first enslaved folks coming to the American British colonies in 1619, 13th Amendment in 1865, so like 250 years. And what's true is that from the moment Black folks arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. This project expanded my conception of like what that fight for liberation looked like and what forms it could take on. But it was clear that resistance was happening from the moment Black folks stepped on these shores. And what that means is that the vast majority of Black people who fought for freedom, the vast majority of enslaved people who fought for freedom, never got a chance to see it. And but they did it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I think, you know, we are only here having this conversation because of generations of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but they wanted me to see, even though they knew they would never know me. And so I think about what sort of responsibility that bestows upon me and what sort of love that represents, right, for a people to fight for something, to fight for the sort of world they knew that they deserved, but that they knew someone else might get to experience. And what sort of, you know, again, responsibility does that create for us to sort of build this world that we might not necessarily see ourselves, or that our children might not necessarily see ourselves, but someday someone will, because that's what somebody did for us. And I think that, you know, that is the love that I felt sort of surrounding the entire time was love for people who loved me, even if they knew they might never know me.
Wow.
But it was sort of omnipresent in all of these places.
Can we just stay with that just for one more minute? I'd just love for you to talk about a little bit more about this expanded sense of what liberation needed to look like. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that so much of this project was, you know, I did not begin this book as an expert on slavery. Far from it, right? This book was written as someone who felt like I needed to fill in a lot of the gaps that I had as a child and that I experienced in my own education. And what I remember feeling as a child, and I write about this a little bit in the book, is a sense of, you know, the slave narratives that I remember hearing were about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And if you're lucky, you hear about Olaudah Equiano and Harriet Jacobs, but people who were these like exceptional people, not just exceptional enslaved people. These are exceptional humans. Like the universe does not make a lot of Harriet Tubmans and Frederick Douglasses. And
Right.
and so as valuable as it is to read those narratives and to read those stories, they also can distort our sense of what life was for the vast majority of enslaved people. And they can distort our sense of what resistance looked like, because you read those stories and we're drawn to them and compelled by them because they're so remarkable. But you know, the vast majority of millions of Black people did not fight their slave breaker, or did not live in Maryland so that they could run away to New York. They did not, or to Canada. They did not have that sort of proximity to the possibility of freedom in ways that facilitated those sorts of decisions. They weren't, you know, one of the greatest, you know, writers and orators of American history and all of these things. But that doesn't mean that their stories are any less worthy of being explored, or that the ways in which they resisted the institution, that might not include running away, that might not include giving speeches, that might not include, you know, being a spy in the Civil War, all the things that made these, again, the stories of these folks so remarkable. But they were constantly asserting their personhood amid an institution that was attempting to strip that personhood away. And really sort of constantly reclaiming agency amid a sense of this omnipresent threat, the omnipresent threat of violence, the omnipresent threat of separation. And I think for me, my sense of what resistance looked like became far more nuanced and robust, because I thought about how difficult it must be in ways that I just really could never fathom, to try to make that there are these millions of people attempting to make meaning for themselves and to make meaning for their families, with the threat of like the spectacle of cruelty, you know, all the ways it can manifest itself hanging over you at all times. And so I think part of what I unlearned over the course of writing this book is the myriad ways, or really having a reductive sense of like what resistance in the context of slavery looked like, and having a much more, hopefully, you know, holistic sense of what that might be.
Yeah, and this is where it seems like, you know, particularly along this axis, your book and Tiya's book are very much in conversation, because Tiya, you talk early in your book about, you know, how, you know, history, as historians tend to study it, is sort of, it favors, you know, people in power, usually whites, usually male, and that the existence and history of Black people has been not written, partially because we've been kept out of writing, literally, and learning to read, and these are all these reclamations that are happening. And so that's, you know, I see this dialogue, like, so Clint's talking in this very broad kind of macro level, and you have this story that's very specific that speaks to this family and how they are reclaiming their humanity and writing their story.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the way you phrased the question really captured the key dilemma that we all face. Scholars, people in the historical profession across various locations, from the academy to, you know, high schools and middle schools to museums, and also the many of us who are very invested in our own family histories. And that dilemma is, history is the finding of facts, or the hoped for finding of facts about the past, the interpretation of those things, and the narrativization of those things. So putting those finds, those discoveries, into a form so that we can interact with it, engage it, understand it, into story-like form. And this is typically based on really the treasure, the love of the Western Academy, of the historical profession, of the scholarly endeavor, and that is the document, the piece of paper, the remain that we have, the artifact that we have, because somebody had the opportunity to be educated and to have a pen put in their hand and to have paper put in their hand or a journal, a diary to write and to have their records saved because they were important and saved by other people, much like them, sharing similar characteristics of opportunity, privilege, phenotype. And then those materials have been cared for and organized and put into files and put into boxes and put into state archives. And that's what we use to try to understand what took place. And we sometimes fall into a hole of thinking, okay, what is in the library, what is in the archive is what existed, is what happened. These are the facts. This is the whole, this is the sum. But we all know that this is just not really the true truth of the matter, because most of our ancestors didn't have that opportunity. The people who did, as Clint has said, were those who were positioned in a particular kind of way, in a certain moment in time, in a certain place, in the landscape, and they just happened to have somebody who owned them, who had a moment of, connection, kindness, maternal feeling, and said, maybe I will teach this one how to read a bit. These were the minority of enslaved people. And we have a very difficult time getting at the majority of that collective experience when we rely on those documents. And so my book centers on this artifact, not a document. It's a cloth, which I think is so beautiful. And Farah knows all about this way more than I do. I mean, it's so beautiful that a woman in this family, a descendant, took it upon herself to save that story of love, survival, connection, and caretaking, and to tell it in cloth. I think that says so much, and I think it speaks back to this insistence that we have to rely on paper documents that are written in a certain kind of way, in a certain kind of language, and filed in a certain kind of container over there in the building where you have to wear gloves to look at it. Mm-hmm. And let me just add one more point to this, because I greatly appreciated what Clint said about the ways in which we tend to turn our attention to incredibly heroic people. And we all love these people. We want heroes. I think sometimes we need heroes. But those heroic people also were flawed, as Farah was saying earlier about people she's writing about in her own beloved family. Is in addition, most people didn't have any of the combination of opportunities, even talents, gifts, skills, connections to be heroic in the way that we tend to look for. And those lives, they tend to be ignored by us. We don't pay attention to them. We don't honor them the way we should. And one of the things that I think is so important and special about these women that I had the privilege of trying to tell their story for in this book is that they weren't among those few enslaved people who were able to learn how to read and who were able to write a narrative, or who were even able to escape, and who were beloved by the abolitionists and who had a platform on which they could speak. No, they lived their lives in enslavement. Although we know they resisted in ways that they could during their lifetimes, their legal liberation, their physical liberation came with emancipation, but the masses of other Black people, with millions of others, right? And they're the people whose lives and whose beautiful stories we don't see. We lose them. And there's so much richness in those stories because, besides the value that we must hold with regard to them, to their individual precious lives, few of us are actually heroes, right? I mean, right. We do need another hero. I would love to see another Harriet Tubman right now, but most of us are just regular people feeling that life is a challenge, and especially in these times, life feels insurmountable. life feels threatening, it's so anxiety provoking. And to know that everyday people, our own ancestors, were able to face the worst of times, I think can be incredibly inspiring for us.
Absolutely. And you know, and that makes me think sort of a slight segue to you, Farah. You know, I know that when in your book, you know, it was the title was given to you by your father, and a note that he left you. But what kind of legacy, just talking about history, what kind of legacy does that suggest for you, or for what you were trying to explore, the stories you were trying to tell?
Yes, I think that, you know, I spend a lot of time with literature by African American writers, and I think where it connects with what Clint and Tiya are saying is that those writers, most the ones that I focus on, you know, and Douglas is in there, and Wheatley, the
Hmm.
exceptions, right? The genius exceptions are there, but many of those writers are really trying to get at those lives that Tiya and Clint are saying, you know, we don't see in the archive. And they were faced with the same thing, right? That there's the archive, and the books that rely on our archive are not giving us these ordinary stories of ordinary human beings and what they're confronting every single day. And it was in the realm of the imagination, right?
Hmm.
So Morrison then imagines the enslaved mother who's faced with the dilemma: do I send this baby back to slavery, or do I send her off to the next world, right?
Hmm.
Or Baldwin, who's writing about struggling, working class, working poor people with the whole state up against them. Again, these are people who would not have left diaries necessarily. And in my own life, you know, a father who's a working class intellectual who wrote notes to his daughter in paperback books. And I think one of the things, you know, that said for me is like, where do we look? You know, where,
Hmm.
you know, that sack that Tiya writes about, right? Where it's embroidered on the sack, right? So where do we look for the writing? What writing do we legitimate? Where are people who do have access to a kind of literacy, but don't have access to publishing, or don't have time to write diaries? Where are they jotting down, you know, their thoughts? And then on the other hand, where are our artists imagining those past and those lives and that sense of interiority that we don't really have access to otherwise?
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I see we've been given the 15-minute warning. So what I'm going to do here, that I really wanted to get to two sort of questions at a much larger level, because I've got three people who are grappling with history, either as historians or as someone who looks at literature across the a large scope. And so when it comes to Black life, and particularly in this moment when history feels so contested, um, is this moment, do you feel that this moment's any different from past efforts of erasure? Or have we seen this before? Or is this some new type of stuff? Or can you give us some perspective, August students of history? Or if you want to go Ta-Nehisi Coates and say, I got no good news for you, that's fine too. But you know.
I mean, I think that it is very clear that part of what we are seeing now is part of a long tradition
Hmm.
in which people uh, there's progress, or there is the presentation of information that complicates, runs counter to, um, creates nuance for the story that people have told about America. You know, I think that in a sort of political context, you know, we see a gaslighting that is not new, right? I mean,
Right.
so one of the things that was most striking for me as I was researching this book was how Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, you know, he wrote the famous or the infamous Cornerstone speech in 1861, where he says, the cornerstone of this new nation, the Confederacy, is slavery, and it is founded on the principle that the white man is superior to the African. It is the reason for the great rupture in the Union is slavery. Well, he makes very clear that slavery is the cause of the war. After the war, people, come up to him and they're like, he's writing his memoirs, and folks are like, so, you said that the Confederacy, that you all were fighting for slavery. Like, what do you have to say for yourself? And he's like, I never said that. And people are like, what are you talking about? Like, we were there. It's in the paper. We heard you say it. And he's like, no, you must be mistaken. I never said anything like that. And so, like, that's a 19th century version of the gaslighting we see with regard to January 6th, where we saw with our own eyes what was happening. And then people are trying to tell us that what we saw isn't what actually happened. And in the context of, the sort of critical race theory wars, it is very clear to me that is part of a backlash to the past decade or so of Black Lives Matter, and the way that the Black Lives Matter movement in the broadest sense and the sort of cultural and social and intellectual pieces that have sort of expanded from it and emerged from it, that there's been a shift in our public consciousness that threatens people's sense of their relationship to this country and how they sort of situate and understand who they are in the world. And that is like an existential crisis for a lot of people. And so there is a forceful pushback to say that much of what, this much more sophisticated understanding of history and racism and white supremacy that not everyone, but more people have developed, more Americans have developed over the past several years, is not true, right? And is somehow reflective of an attempt to indoctrinate students or mislead people, and they attempt to turn empirical statements into ideological ones, right? So if I were to say the Confederacy was a treasonous territory that raised an army predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, in a lot of classrooms across the country, that will be understood as an ideological statement, or one that's based on a set of opinions, or one that is reflective of a political disposition, and not one that's actually grounded in many primary source documents and empirical evidence. But that's the goal, is to create this sort of confusion, this Orwellian muddling. And that's what Lost Cause was trying to do immediately after the Civil War as well. So all that's to say, it is not new, but I think we all constantly see new iterations of it throughout time.
Not new, but new iterations. Tiya, Farah, any thoughts on any words of to help us all through this?
I miss my grandmother so much more every day than I ever have before in our present moment, and I always miss her dearly. But I so desperately wish that I could have her voice and her wisdom and her analysis of what is going on around us, because I know that she would have nailed it. She would have pegged it, because she was so wise, so smart. And she could have explained to me how on earth we ended up with Donald Trump as president. But I do agree that there is a through line here, that we are in some ways seeing echoes, and we're in sort of this loop. Perhaps it's a negative feedback loop that keeps growing into the past. And I agree with commentary that has been made about this feeling like the moment of reconstruction, almost, in the way that the country is so divided, and certain sectors are attempting ingenious ways to retrench. And yet this is a different moment, because we're all teetering on multiple kinds of edges. So there's this racial knife's edge, there's this political edge around authoritarianism and growing conservatism, not just in the US, but around the world. There's the ecological edge, the mass extinction and climate change. And I think that we all know, we sense that this is a very fragile moment.
Mm-hmm.
And when we are anxious, I think that we turn to those spaces of comfort and reassurance. And unfortunately, in this country, for some parts of the population, those spaces of comfort and reassurance have been this sense of traditionalism or this sense of heritage, which really is steeped very much in a Eurocentric vision of what this country should be, who should be here, who should have certain kinds of rights and privileges. And even though that kind of a sensibility has been with us all along among some groups, there was a time when it was not okay to just say that, right? Maybe they said it in their closed circles, and I mean, I think that we know that. But in terms of in public culture, there was a sense of a holding back and a sense of propriety, and a sense of we should be striving to be better. And now I think the guardrails that had been holding things together, at least on the surface, have really been done away with. And we have political leaders, unfortunately, who are willing to just be quite forthright with their desire to diminish voting rights. They're willing to be forthright with their desire to speak only to certain subsets of the population. And it makes me feel quite concerned about what's going to happen, especially politically at the national level, the state level, over the next few years. I won't say that I won't have hope, because I think we must have hope. I think we wouldn't be here if our ancestors didn't have hope. But we are really up against it, I think.
Right, right. Farah?
I agree with everything that's been said. I think that this is the most fragile moment that we've, confronted, certainly in our lifetime, that many of us could not have expected being here. I do think that there's always that sort of American will to innocence,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like what Baldwin says, that's the crime, right? The crime is the innocence, the so-called innocence, ignorance of the history, a desire to be ignorant about our history. I think one of the things that's different about this moment is that there's so much work.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so much work. That thing that was Negro history is just a body of extraordinary work that we all stand on and build upon to push back. And in some moments, I think that this sort of refusal of history is because it was working. It's because it was actually working. It's because people were using frameworks that were created by Black feminists, like intersectionality, to talk about the need for intersectional analyses. And it's because students had read Morrison, and when they saw what happened to George Floyd, instead of being told, oh, that's not what you think it is, they were like, no, we know what that is. We've studied that, we've seen that, we know what that is. Mm-hmm. And that's what got them out in the street. And so I think that it's the fear of that, of what has worked and what we got right. It's the fear of that we are experiencing a kind of backlash against. But that's because it was working. It's because we created a body of work and a movement that really was forcing a kind of change, and that can still force change, I think.
Right. And so I see that we have less than 5 minutes, probably 3 minutes. And so my last question to all three of you, so you get probably a minute apiece, is given that we live in this and have lived in this country that wills itself to ignorance and innocence and is wholly ahistorical and proudly ahistorical, how would you like your books to function? And what's the role that you hope your books play in this deeply ahistorical country? Clint.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it before, but I hope that my book can just remind people that this wasn't that long ago, right? That in the scope of human history, I mean, this was just yesterday. That there are people who are alive today, right now, in this country, who were loved, were raised by, were in community with people who were born into chattel slavery, right? And so this is not distant. This is not irrelevant to the contemporary landscape of inequality. It created it. And I think that reminding ourselves of our proximity to that history is incredible. It has been transformative in the way that I understand, I observe and make sense of our society. And so I hope it can be helpful in that for others.
Great. Tiya, how do you see your book functioning, sort of, as Farah saying, to push back?
Well, I feel that we as a country have been transfixed by an ill-begotten and a damaging set of values. A set of values that has told people that they can define other people as things, they can own them, they can sell them, they can treat them inhumanely. And we have dotted our landscape with testaments to this wrong set of values in the form of various kinds of monuments and some of the plantation sites that Clint talks about in his book. One of the things that I hope that my book can do, which focuses on this very small object, a tactile object, a textile, a piece of fabric sewn by a young Black woman, is to remind us that we can look to a different set of values that is carried in different kinds of cultural remains. Instead of a monument, we can look to a beautiful and deceptively simple cotton sack passed down by Black women.
Thank you. And Farah.
Yeah, I would follow Tiya and say that because my book, each chapter is a value. It's a moral, and it's a reminder of an alternative set of values and ethics by which a community under siege, constantly facing catastrophe, lived and survived in the face of that. And it's just, I would hope that it would be a reminder to the necessity of that alternative set of values, which is really about an ethic of care, how we care for each other, and not just we as a family or we as Black people, but we as human beings, how we care for each other and how we care for this planet. I hope that that's what my book will remind people to think about.
Wow, thank you. I just want to say that it has been quite an honor to be involved with the three of you tonight and engaged in this conversation. You all are amazing. You all have written, powerful works. I encourage everyone who's listening and watching this, please support the authors, buy the books, tell a friend to tell a friend, all that good stuff. And, that's too is how the word in the book is passed, right? So let's just go do it, support your authors. And I want to thank Tiya Miles, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Clint Smith III, for joining us here at the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival. And my name is Rob Fields. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank
Good night, everyone.
Bye.